All right, we're all set now. We have our new spinning outfit, maybe our bait caster. The only thing we need is an artificial lure, and let's go catch some fish. Before we get too deep into this, I want to take a moment and talk about active fishing. Active fishing is a term that I use for things that you have to do yourself, namely when using artificial lures. An artificial lure is really nothing more than a chunk of wood, a piece of plastic. It by itself that can't really catch fish. You have to impart some type of action, some life to that piece of wood, piece of plastic, and hence the term active fishing. I can't think of a better place to start off talking about the wide variety of artificial lures more than a Rapala Minnow. Rapala is a company that's been around since, well, it started before the Second World War and paused and then kind of picked up again and took off after the war. Rapala is the largest producer of artificial lures in the world. They have caught more tournament fish than any other lure combined. So this is the typical artificial lure, the Rapala Minnow. It's this particular one is a floating lure. It's designed to float on the surface of the water. They also make various models in intermediate divers, and even some that will go very, very deep, and you can bounce them off the bottom. If you notice, this has a tie-in point right up here. You have the body of the lure. You have the hooks. These hooks are usually attached with some type of a split ring. Some fishermen will change out the hooks that come with a lure and install larger hooks. So let's say this lure comes with a size 4. They'll change these out to a size 2, something a little bigger. Some people feel that the lure manufacturers are trying to save a little bit of money, so they kind of undersize the hooks. This is kind of inside baseball. I've never had a problem with the lure coming from the hooks coming from the manufacturer. Some people will change out the front hook with a red colored treble hook, and they feel that this kind of gives a little flash of blood or a flash of distress. It's more attractive to the fish. Again, that's kind of an inside baseball thing. The real working part of this lure is this lip right here. You can get into some real deep weeds. This would be a good project for an engineering student. If you change the angle of this lip, you will change the action of the lure. Right now, the way this is made and the size of this lip, you get this very nice oscillating side to side kind of wobble. It looks very much like a fish swimming through the water. I also think that since we have metal to metal connections with the split ring right here, we get a little sound generation. And I think that is also attractive to bass and other species. By changing the area of this lip and changing the angle of this lip, you can make a lure that will dive really deep, a lure that is very shallow, one that has just a little bit of wobble, or one that just shoots from one side over to the other in a 2 or 3 foot swath. It's really quite fascinating if you get into lure making and really play with these with a different type of lip profiles. This is a very brief history of the founder of Rapala Lure, Lori Rapala. I've been accused of getting into too much history, so I will let you just read this on your own. And if you are really interested, I invite you to go to Canvas under Files. There's a PowerPoint presentation called Famous Fisherman. And in that presentation, there's no audio to it. It's all what I used to use in a classroom lecture until I was putting too many people to sleep. But you can read it and get a lot of great information out of it. Any advertising, marketing majors might want to take a look at it because it's a very, very interesting story. Now this is a rattle shad, and if you notice that it has a tie-in right up here in the middle of its back. It functions similar to the Rapala Minnow in that it incorporates the lip right here in the actual body. This is a diving lure, and what is unique about it is that Lori Rapala, the inventor of this lure, put a few BBs inside in a little tube. And whenever you cast this out and start reeling in, this lure will dive, it will flutter back and forth, but those BBs generate sound. And this is a very effective lure. It's been used, for decades, and it's caught a lot of fish. And here's a brief history on Bill Lewis. This is one of my favorite lures. This is a jitterbug. My uncle gave me a jitterbug in 1971, maybe 72, just I think a year or so before he passed away. And this is a lure that is a topwater lure. It doesn't dive. It stays right up on the top. It's a floating lure. And this lure is very old also. It was invented by Fred Arbogast in Akron, Ohio. Again, that's that kind of that Midwest connection. Very interesting story about Fred. I invite you to read the Famous Fisherman PowerPoint. Anyway, he designed this as a floating lure, and he literally cut the spoon off of one of his wife's silverware. And he was trying to get this thing to dive, to make a diver out of it. But a friend who came over for Sunday dinner was looking at it and suggested that instead of making a diver, he make a topwater floating lure. And so Fred tinkered around with it and installed the spoon like this, took it out, and immediately started to catch fish with it. The spoon, when you're pulling it through the water, it literally plows water. And as it's plowing water, it entraps some air. And so you get this bloop, 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 these bubbles forming. And this can be just absolutely dynamite. If you go out to a nice calm lake on a hot August day, wait for evening to start to fall, the shadows are getting long, and locate a weed bed and cast this lure out along the border, the edges of that weed bed. Cast it out, let it hit, let the rings dissipate, and then give it a few turns. Just reel it in, a foot, maybe 2 feet. Just a slow blop, 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 and then pause it. Let those rings dissipate again, and then repeat this. There's a bass down in those weeds that is hearing this and is seeing this and is feeling this. And he's not exactly sure what it is. It sounds a lot like a frog, but it sounds really tasty. And by the time you get that lure out of those weeds, you will probably have this giant explosion, water spraying all over the place, and this big old bass latched on to the end of a jitterbug. Incredibly effective lure. In classes, I've taken a survey of people who have used a jitterbug, and I've asked them if they've caught fish, and every single one of them have indicated that yes, they've caught fish. One thing I'd like to mention about topwater lures up here. Fish only feed off of the surface about 5% of the time. So if you only have topwater lures in your tackle box, you're missing a lot of fish. If you're out in really cold temperatures, if you're out in the middle of the day and you're dragging the topwater lure, it's very unlikely that you're going to catch anything with that. Fish are a little finicky about that. The best times I've seen for topwater is early in the morning and late at night. The warmer the water, it almost seems the better. In the springtime is a good time if you slow down. Right after the spawn, which we'll talk about in more detail in the next unit, that can be really, really good. So include some topwater lures in your tackle box. Don't rely upon them for most of your fish, but they are just so much fun to use. Just to see that explosion, and sometimes you'll get a trailing fish, whereas your lure reeling in the lure, you'll see the fish trail the lure. You'll see this bulge in the water, and it just sometimes can make your heart stop, seeing that. This is a spoon. Spoons are unique. Again, kind of discovered, invented, created around the 1900s, early 1900s. And again, this is another piece of cutlery that has befallen to a mad fisherman. Lou Eppinger up in Michigan sacrificed one of his wife's silver spoons. Just kind of had this wild idea that this is a nice shiny spoon, and I've seen bait fish flash in the water as the sun hits them. Wonder if I could mimic that with this spoon. And so he cut the handle off, smoothed out the metal, drilled 2 holes in each end of it, and took it out into, I believe it was Lake Michigan, and caught fish straight away. Worked beautifully. And he started to manufacture these. They were originally marketed as the Osprey lure. Then his nephew Ed decided he wanted to honor the U.S. Marines who had fought in Belleau Woods during the World War I in Europe, and so he changed it to the Daredevil. And Lou didn't like using the word devil, and so they changed it to devil. So if anyone's talking about a daredevil, you can correct them and say it's technically devil, in honor of the United States Marine Corps. See, the things you learn in this class, just absolutely fascinating. Anyway, the red and white pattern is the signature lure. They also, come in a multitude of different colorations. This is kind of a pike a pattern. There's literally hundreds of different colorations, but the red and white is the classic. The backside is silver, to mimic that flash of the fish. Now there are hundreds of copies of the Daredevil spoon. In my experience, most of them don't even come close to catching fish the way the Daredevil does. There's a special way of weighting this outer perimeter that gives it a very unique action that the cheap knockoff copies do not do, and I think it does make a difference. Now, as this is moving through the water, it's oscillating, it's fluttering. And most people think that the sight of that flash and this coloration is what attracts. But as fishermen and scientists kind of dive into sound more and more, they have measured the unique sound signature of this lure going through the water. And guess what? It actually mimics a lot of the sound of bait fish. So this is something that they probably got absolutely right, and it caught fish, but perhaps they didn't know exactly why it was catching fish. So anyway, very interesting. I would highly recommend everyone have a Daredevil in your tackle box. They come in very, very, very tiny sizes, like a 1/16 of an ounce or even 32nd of an ounce, all the way up to 3, 4, 5 inches long. Very effective lure. Jigs are another very effective lure. This is the famous Lucky Strike. Jigs is a category of lures that has really kind of exploded over the last several years. They come in just such a wide variety of configurations. This is what we would refer to as a hair-dressed lure. This is deer hair, bucktail, and it's tied on up here. There's a little bit of a collar. It kind of hides the hook, but more importantly, it gives the jig body. What does this jig imitate? Well, really, like all these other lures, with the exception of the jitterbug and the Rapala minnow, it is imitating bait fish, something that fish like to eat. And the jig is very handy, in which you have a lead weight built into the hook. So you have the weight and the hook in one combination. You can buy just the bare lead weight with the hook and do with it whatever you want. You can sometimes you'll tip these with a preserved bait, like a pig rind. Sometimes you'll tip them with a piece of nightcrawler or minnow. These are incredibly effective whenever you team them up with soft plastic baits, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Very, very versatile. You can fish these off the bottom, drag them across the bottom. You can bounce them across the bottom. You can fish them mid-depth. You can troll with these. You can suspend them and just jig. Very, very versatile lure. One of my all-time favorites, an inline spinnerbait. This has a central shaft, wire right through here, this chunk of lead that is usually painted, and you have a blade. This blade will revolve around that central shaft. As it's revolving, it also flutters. It oscillates back and forth. Yeah, on a bright sunny day, the sun's going to hit this blade and it's going to give you a flash. The fish will see that flash, think it's bait. But again, scientists are measuring the sound that this lure is producing, and it sounds almost exactly like a bait fish or a very young bluegill. And so I can't overemphasize how important sound is with these various lures. Back here is the dressed hook buried in some squirrel tail. I have caught a lot of really nice bluegill and a few small bass using an inline spinner baits. In the early spring, this is one of the first lures I go to. You can fish these in a number of different ways. You can cast it out and just rip it back in, just as fast as you can. You can cast it out, let it sink, raise your rod tip, reel in, let it sink, lift the rod tip, reel in, let it sink, and kind of this up and down, struggling fish, type motion. It is not weedless, and don't be surprised whenever you catch, a bunch of weeds into hooks. That's the one thing that this just does not do a real good job of. Unless you go to a safety pin spinnerbait. This was the inline spinnerbait. This is the safety pin style spinnerbait. Now here we have combined, in essence, a jig, because this is a chunk of lead that's been painted with an eye on it to look like a fish. This one is dressed with rubber legs. You can see them flaring out here. It helps to hide the hook, and it also gives the lure body. But now we can mount a couple different blades out here. Whenever you get really, really serious about spinnerbaits, you get into different blade styles. And there's probably at least a dozen different blade styles out there. Different lengths, different widths, different shapes, and different colors. And some fishermen who are really into this will change up the color of the blades or the shape of the blades, because these blades, each one of them, are going to produce a little different sound, and they really believe that can be the key, for a strike. The one nice thing about these safety pin spinners is that you can pretty much drag them through vegetation and not get a hookup. Honestly, I have never used a safety pin spinner like this. They are kind of big. They're kind of clunky. Videos that I've watched of people using this are basically casting it out and just ripping it through something as hard and fast as you can, and it will incite a reaction strike where sometimes the fish is not even hungry, but it sees this thing and it just kind of pisses it off, and it goes up there and it attacks. Okay, let's talk about soft plastics. And before we get too far into this, I want to make a distinction in artificial lures. There's two categories. There's the hard baits, such as this safety pin spinner, and soft baits. Soft baits are basically plastics. To distinguish between the two, if you are in a metal canoe out in the middle of the lake and you drop your Rapala lure, your Daredevil spoon, or your safety pin spinner, and it hits the bottom of the canoe, it's going to make a big clank. It's hard. Soft baits are generally plastic. And if you drop them, it's not going to make a sound. Soft baits started in, I would say, the late 60s, really took off in the 70s. I can remember being a kid, fishing, and everyone was catching bass on purple plastic worms. Why were they purple? I had no idea. I had caught a lot of night crawlers, but I had never caught a purple night crawlers. And if you weren't catching them on purple worms, then you switched to black and you were catching fish. There were so many fish being caught on these plastics. They were incredibly, incredibly effective. Gary Yamamoto was one of the guys who really kind of put a modern spin on what was then an old plastic worm. I'll kind of cut to the chase here because this is rather a long story. He started to make his own plastic worms, and he added salt to the formulation. You can make your own soft baits. It's very simple. You buy plastic bait part A and plastic bait part B, 2 different containers. You mix them together and you pour them into a mold and you let them harden. Then you pull the mold apart, trim off the little tailings, and you have a plastic lure. I mean, you literally can do this in your dorm room. It is not rocket science. If you want to add a little bit of glitter, you just mix that in. If you want to add a little bit of salt, you can mix that in. Maybe you're a real big fan of garlic, a little bit of garlic oil. You can mix that in. You can create your own lures. Not difficult at all. You just need to buy the molds and to buy the resins. And you mix the two together, boom, you've got it. Anyway, Gary Yamamoto developed the Cinco style worms that had the added benefit of salt. And so now we're getting a little bit of a taste. When he was fishing tournament with soft plastics, he noticed that there was a very high rejection rate of the fish. Whenever a fish would attack, would latch onto the artificial bait, it would spit it out very, very quickly. And he was thinking that if we add a little bit of salt to that, maybe we can get that fish to hold on to that lure for, even just a half second, maybe a second longer. That's enough to get a really good hook set. And it turned out that he was absolutely correct. And if you think about it, a lot of people will add salt to their food. As any chef will tell you, salt makes anything taste better because we as humans have a real affinity for salt, and apparently the largemouth bass seem to like it too. This is an original tube. It's a piece of plastic that imitates something that fish like to eat. It could be a bait fish, it could be a worm, it could be a crayfish. It's something. So you don't have to be absolutely specific as to what these plastics are imitating. This gets into a category of what we call suggestive lures. It only has to kind of suggest that it's good to eat to the fish to get consumed. We also have soft plastics that believe it or not, resemble fish. And this is the Zaddy shad. It's been around for ages. You can rig this in a number of different ways, sometimes with a jig, sometimes with just a bare hook. You can hook this wacky style. It's a whole category of soft plastics that is imitating minnows without all the fuss and the bother of actually going to the bait shop and buying minnows and the bait bucket and the aerator and so on and so forth. There's a lot of different lures out there. If you walk into any, Cabela's, Bass Pro Shop, Dick's, and you look down the aisle, I mean, there's just hundreds and hundreds of lures. Some of them are designed to catch fish. A few's probably designed to catch fishermen. You'll end up with your favorites. And one of the best ways to really kind of determine what to buy is, what are your buddies using? What are they catching fish with? If you're out fishing, you come across another fisherman, strike up a conversation, and you get talking about lures. They'll usually share what they're catching the fish on. This gives you just kind of a rough idea of how you can break down and make sense of all these different lures. Over here we have hard baits, and then we have soft baits. And what we talked about today is the topwater or surface plugs, and there are literally hundreds of them. I mean, I only mentioned the one, the jitterbug, or the Rapala minnow if you get a floater. Crankbaits is a term that you will hear for pretty much any hard plastic lure that's not floating, and something that has a lip. And different, as we talked about, the different lip styles will produce different actions of that lure. Now, one thing that manufacturers are starting to get really good at are suspended lures. And what they do is they play around with the density of the lure so that they can get a lure that when you throw it in the water, it doesn't sink 100 feet to the bottom, but it will sink down to, let's say, 20 feet and just kind of float there, because the density of the lure is equal to the density of the water at that depth. Maybe one will hold at 10 feet. There's just a great big huge category out there, and read the label. That is probably the best advice I can give. Most of the labels will do a really good job explaining exactly what the lure is designed to do. Not only are you going to get the weight of the lure, which is important to match that lure weight with your rod, but also if it's a sinker, what depth it's designed to run at, so on and so forth. The spinner baits, we talked about the inline spinners, the safety pin spinners, and the buzz baits. That's actually supposed to be buzz, B-U-Z-Z. Obviously, I can't spell. I don't have an image of those. They're out there. I've never used them. You might see them in your travels. We talked about spoons, and we talked about jigs and how versatile jigs can be, especially whenever you team them up with some of the soft plastics. In the soft plastic category, we talked about the rubber worms, the Senkos, tubes, creature baits. These are lures that are shaped like crayfish, maybe frogs, salamanders, any creepy crawly thing that is in the water that fish would want to eat. The one thing we didn't talk about very much are swim baits. Swim baits is a kind of a relatively new category. They are a soft plastic lure that imitates a minnow, like the satty shad. Yet often these swim baits come with hooks already installed, so to speak, embedded hooks. So you can go into a sporting goods store, you can pick up a package of these swim baits. It already has the lure with the hook. The only thing you have to do is take it out of the package, tie it on, and go fishing. In fact, a lot of these will also have a scent added to them to kind of give you a little bit of an extra edge on fishing.